welcome back to the Art Channel. My name's Grace Adam and this is my colleague Joshua White. And this week we have our second film on the work of Pablo Bronstein. We're here at Nottingham Contemporary where he has amassed around 60 objects from Chatsworth. He has curated them and responded to them, in particular with a frieze drawing exploring the Via Appia in Rome.
The Via Appia runs around this gallery here and is a whimsical exploration of this route leading out of ancient Rome that was lined with tombs and mansions of the aristocrats that subsequently, in the 18th century, tourists on the Grand Tour would go to visit, and they would buy illustrations of these ruins to take back to their country houses in England.
So this frieze of drawings, actually conceived as one piece of work, is called Cross-Section of the Via Appia in Rome, and it's Bronstein looking at the idea of the Grand Tour, of cultural tourism, and a kind of collection of fantasy buildings and tombs, and this drawing wraps around the first room in the gallery.
So they're not topographical, are they, in terms of description, although they appear to be renditions of observed remains and archaeological ruins. Instead, they are fantasies from his imagination, drawing on, of course, this famous location on the outskirts of Rome, in fact, a road that led out of Rome, where many prominent aristocrats and Roman figures would build their mansions and also erect their tombs. And in this piece, we can see this rather enchanting silhouette almost of these columns and decorative finials, and even a cross-section of this building that appears to be like a folly, really, with this very elaborate, rich palette of lime, yellow and pinks and turquoise, with this statue on a plinth at the centre.
I think it's interesting because he calls it a cross-section, and actually it is in parts but not in all parts. So we have, like you say, this cross-section of this fantastically opulent interior, and then these rather more demure watercolour images behind of these fantastical tombs. But it builds up this, they're romantic images. I mean, the Via Appia, the idea of this tourism, of visiting these antiquities is really very romantic and still retains this kind of cachet. And I think he really taps into that.
And of course, he's inspired by the tradition in the 18th century of prints made by printmakers like Piranesi that would describe these ruins along the Via Appia and in Rome itself. And there are a series of quotations taking place here, and I think that's what interests him. How we can keep going back, ransacking the past for inspiration in the 18th century or even today in that neoclassical idiom, to the point that it becomes a parody.
Yes. Yeah, they're very knowing. They are pastiches, they are comments on, but I still think they acknowledge the fact that we are still fascinated by the Baroque, by Rome, by antiquity, by the place of expensive objects within collections, and I think he's tackling that within this show, and indeed has bought objects from Chatsworth and refers to them quite knowingly. So it's a postmodern look at how we collect, how we travel.
And also the development, a history of the development of taste. And taste is such a complex subject, isn't it? This whole anxiety around it that prevails today about owning the right objects made by the right designers, about being able to display affluence and status, and also a kind of connoisseur's eye, and how close we can sail to the edge of good taste and tip into bad taste.
Yes, yeah, and the objects, the drawings in these galleries feel very different to being at Chatsworth. They have a different meaning. They are still exclusive. A gallery is always going to be exclusive, isn't it? But they have a very different feel. You put these objects in a minimalist setting, which is not a new thing to do, but I think he does it carefully, and there are not many pieces here, so you have a chance to really try and understand them.
This drawing stands out because it has an air of functionality. I mean, it's still made with that interest in the fetish for the ruin, for the archaeological fragment, but it appears to be more kind of functional and structurally sound than some of the other buildings described by Bronstein. And when I look at this, I'm reminded of buildings in the 20th century, like a telephone exchange, or perhaps a local authority office block. You have this grid of plaques, and it is dressed in this neoclassical language, which summons up this theme that I think he's interested in, of the power of certain design styles to confer authority and prestige onto a building. I mean, we've got here features around the door. You've got the pilasters and the statuary at the top on the roofline.
It does feel very much like a building that has a job. We don't know what the job is, but it does feel like that. As you say, it's an old-fashioned telephone exchange. For me, it's a Le Corbusier block of flats that somebody has come along and redressed, unhappy with kind of pure modernism. But it definitely feels like something that does something, and it feels very different from the first part of the drawing that we looked at. There is an absence of colour. There's a real formality about it and a solidity about it. And it's in this, there's a lot of stuff missing here. There are a lot of gaps, spaces, deliberately spare landscape that it's in. So it feels quite different. And I think the way he can travel through all of those pastiches and references within one piece of work is quite a strong thing to be able to do.
And continuing the theme of tombs and monuments, this sort of indeterminate building could also operate rather like an ossuary, as if these are shelves or spaces for storing the remains of deceased people. So perhaps it has a kind of macabre character.
Definitely. It is quite a threatening building, actually, isn't it? You don't know what it does, but there's this idea of a modular system, a way of ordering the world in some way.
So this foot is an example of an object that would have entered the collection at Chatsworth following a grand tour by one of the ancestors, the predecessors, and it's full of suggestion and possibility. It has all of the romance of an archaeological fragment that was so appealing and entrancing to those travellers in the 18th century, that connection to classical civilization, that idea of reaching back in time and then actually sourcing a surviving example of classical design and then bringing it back to this extraordinary house in the East Midlands in the Peak District, and keeping it as a souvenir, really, of those sunny days in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, as you say, of actually having a piece of history, literally a piece of history that you can come back and slot into your collection, your very upmarket, tourist tat, in a way. It's quite a fascinating object, and to dislocate it repeatedly, it comes from Italy, it comes to the East Midlands, into this wonderful house, then it comes to a contemporary gallery in the middle of a city centre, so it becomes more and more absurd in a way. But I think also it allows, as you say, some space for romance and imagining, and I think Bronstein's very interested in that space for imagining. It's part, probably, of a huge sculpture. We don't know what the rest of it looked like, and that's quite fascinating because we can fill in the gaps. And I also think, for me, I'm really interested in it because it's a beautiful object and it's a part of a body, and it's bigger than my foot, and it's done things. I can see a life, I can see a history on it, and humans are always interested in themselves, and that has that very base fascination.
The dislocation through those series of moves, Rome to Chatsworth and now here to Nottingham, adds to its complexity and curiosity because it keeps opening up suggestibility. And I think Bronstein has selected an object like this because it describes this larger story of this ongoing fascination, certainly in Britain, with the classical Mediterranean, with this romance of travel, with the authority and purity of classical civilization, you know, which is seen as an exemplar of sort of European achievement.
And it still has this incredible status. You know, even though we travel further and further away from that life, that time, it still has a fascination always. That connection with another world that we hold up as an exemplary piece of living.
We're looking at 5 Delft vases made in 1690 that Pablo Bronstein has selected from the collection at Chatsworth. And I think he's done so because of the historical connection to the house itself. Because the house was finished in 1696 in this new Baroque style. These objects connect us to the continent, to the Netherlands, where they were made in the city of Delft, and they connect the viewer to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, this new political settlement in Britain, when King William was invited by Whig aristocrats to depose James II. And the Duke of Devonshire was the first Duke, was a very prominent supporter of this revolution. So there are lots of historical echoes and connections with these objects.
And they're very much, obvious thing to say, but they're very much about status, they're about wealth, they are about gathering exceptional objects, which are perhaps just on the verge of being mass-produced. This is not a unique collection of these objects, but they are nevertheless strange and exotic, and designed originally to take flowers, fresh flowers. So they're rather extraordinary objects, and I think here they become, for me, pieces of sculpture. The way they're displayed in a contemporary space makes me view them as sculpture rather than decorative, sort of semi-functional objects.
He's very deliberately cased them up in this bespoke display cabinet or vitrine, and I think it reminds us of how objects become almost inert, sort of possibly viewed as objects in a time warp. They've lost their original liveliness. We can't see those fresh flowers in them anymore. It's just a little snapshot of taste in the 1690s in Britain. Objects of luxury, of desirability, of wealth and status.
And it's amazing how we, as 21st century humans, look back at taste and consider whether it's good taste or bad taste. Kind of knowingly, in our postmodern way, we visit galleries and we look at these collections of objects. And they, as you say, they are so disconnected from their original functions. And I think they definitely, it's something about the way we fetishize objects still. We always have. Since we made objects, we do this to them. And in this kind of bizarre vitrine, this case, they become extraordinary and I feel very disconnected from them.
We're looking here at this mock Greek building or pavilion that Pablo Bronstein has designed explicitly to house this selection of silverware from Chatsworth. And we can see they are very theatrical, objects of immense craftsmanship, but also luxury, of expense, of aristocratic taste. At the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, we have 2 soup tureens by Paul Storr, who was the preeminent Regency silversmith in England. And we have these pilgrim bottles that the curators acknowledge would never be transported anywhere. They are not functional. They are emblematic and symbolic, aren't they?
I think this is a fascinating little kind of bunker, isn't it? As you say, it's a kind of classical portico or hut almost, housing this just extraordinary kind of miniature collection. And I guess it's in no way a kind of academic survey of silverware through the centuries. Bronstein has plucked out the most extraordinary, almost obscene pieces of bling, of amazing kind of pieces of work which are designed to be used, but I guess were probably not used, as you say. The flasks are unusable, and it's in this kind of mirrored cabinet, so you are faced with even more silver than you thought you were. So there are lots of kind of visual tricks. It's very over the top, but I think one of the beautiful things is you can get up close, possibly closer than you can at Chatsworth. So it's nice to be able to inspect these pieces of work.
Well, you have this slippage, don't you, from the collection at the house into a gallery context, which we've seen with other objects. But you also mention how it's not an academic display. No collection arguably ever is. It's ultimately an expression of individual taste and again of fashion in a particular moment. And so any collection, I think Bronstein is acknowledging, is a strange accumulation of objects through fate and idiosyncratic, choice.
And I think, we're trying to understand, is Bronstein drawing our attention to the British aristocracy, the British class system, the idea of fetish objects, the idea of useless objects? Are they truly beautiful to him? I think they must function in lots of different ways for an artist like Bronstein.
Bronstein acknowledges himself in discussion that he's also excited by their possibility because they carry a degree of optimism. And certainly in the 18th century into the 19th century, Britain's wealth, its trading power, gave this country immense confidence, and the governing class that confidence that they could then invest in objects through commissioning or collecting. And so this isn't necessarily an inquiry about pure wealth, but actually about the possibility of craftsmanship, of knowledge handed down amongst silversmiths and other craftspeople. And
as you say, it's very much about the British upper classes. You can be optimistic in that position, and you can display your wealth and your travel and the fact that you can employ the very best Northern European craftsmen. So it's a beautiful slice of a difficult part of history.
So we conclude with these two films, looking at Pablo Bronstein's exhibitions at both Chatsworth and here at Nottingham Contemporary, part of this new concept of a modern grand tour, harking back to the grand tour of the 18th century. Pablo Bronstein has made original work, but also curated and selected a series of objects in the biggest loan of artifacts from Chatsworth in 30 years. And on the whole, I think it's a very satisfying inquiry about the status of a house, a collection, this almost fetish-like interest in the classical past and Britain's relationship to the Mediterranean, particularly to Italy.
I think, as you say, it's very ambitious. It tackles an interesting hierarchical part of British history. It tackles the idea of Britain's collecting objects from other cultures. And he looks at the idea of being a connoisseur, a collector, of amassing objects, of the status of objects and of wealth in a contemporary and a kind of neoclassical setting. So I think it's an ambitious project.
And of course there's a lot of relevance to life today. There's that ironic, rather whimsical approach in Bronstein's work. It's very knowing, it veers on the edge of camp, but the drawings are very beautifully made. They are made with extraordinary skill and an eye for detail. And of course he gives full rein to his imagination, drawing on this sort of encyclopedic knowledge of classical design from the past and from the Baroque period and later. So, it raises lots of issues, lots of questions. It's very rich, very deep,
There are some loose ends. Sometimes the material doesn't directly kind of correspond together, particularly here at Nottingham Contemporary, I think. Do you agree?
I do. I think it's a very difficult thing to pull off. There is this vast, rich collection amassed over decades, hundreds of years. You then have to make a decision about what to show and what to say about it. And it's a challenging part of history. And it's very easy to slip totally into camp or into kitsch. He doesn't do that. He teeters on the brink, and I think what saves the drawings in particular from kitsch is that he truly loves the pieces of work that he's looking at, even though he wants to make a comment about their political status.